Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. We left the previous chapter in a garden, watching the first human being decide to source his own mind, to trust his own eyes over his Father's word, to be the one who determines good and evil. One couple, one quiet, ordinary, catastrophic choice. But a made-up mind does not stay put. It is the most contagious thing in the world. Parent to child, neighbor to neighbor, generation to generation. And it gathers speed. Read on past the garden, and only a few chapters later one arrives at one of the bleakest sentences in all of Scripture. God's own assessment of the race he had made. Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Sit with the words. Not some people, sometimes. Every intention of every thought of every heart. Only evil. Continually. The disease that began with two people in a garden has gone pandemic. And heart here is again the Hebrew lev. Not the seat of feeling, but the inner room where a person thinks and weighs and decides. The whole world's thinking had become a factory running on a single fuel. I will decide for myself. This is the chapter in which we learn how large the problem we have been describing actually is. Here Genesis tells us something most readers were never taught. Something strange, easy to skip, and important. The corruption of the human mind was not entirely homegrown. Just before the flood, Genesis reports that the sons of God saw the daughters of men and took them, and that this was bound up with the earth's filling with violence. The text is famously spare, and the identity of these sons of God is debated. Read by some as the godly line of Seth, by others as dynastic rulers, but most plausibly, and on the oldest and most widely attested reading, as rebel spiritual beings. That is certainly how the Second Temple world understood it, and how the apostles do. Both Peter and Jude speak of angels who sinned and did not keep their proper domain, tying them to precisely this episode. The detail that matters is what that tradition says these powers did. They taught. In the Enochic literature, the rebel watchers hand humanity a forbidden, counterfeit knowledge. Metalworking and weaponry, sorcery and enchantment, the arts that promise mastery. One need not adjudicate the lurid particulars to grasp the point. The made-up mind has a supply line. It is not merely that we are clever at deceiving ourselves. There are powers in this universe with an interest in keeping us sourcing our own minds and glad to provide the wisdom for the project. Recall that the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers. This is where that blinding begins. The counterfeit is not only manufactured in the human heart. Some of it is imported. The serpent in the garden was never working alone. And note the irony that the rebel's gift is precisely illicit knowledge. A counterfeit gnosis dispensed by powers other than the Creator. The reader will meet that shape again. So picture it, a planet of self-sourced minds, fed by rebel powers, every thought bent. What does God do with a world like that? He does two things, and both must be seen. For together, they form the pattern he will keep for the rest of the Bible and the rest of history. First, he judges. The flood is not random weather. It is a deliberate unmaking. The very waters God had pushed back to make room for dry land, in the beginning, come rushing in again. The fountains of the great deep bursting up and the windows of the heavens opening. The careful separations of Genesis 1 reversed. The world briefly returned to the formless deep from which it had been ordered. When a mind has wholly surrendered itself to the counterfeit, there is a mercy, terrible as it is, in not permitting it to run on forever. But, and this is the half we dare not miss, he keeps a remnant. In the midst of that drowning world stands one sentence. Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. One man, one family. Not because Noah was flawless, but because God refused to let the faithful line die out. He carried them through the unmaking in a wooden box and brought them out into a washed world to begin again. A kind of new Adam, handed the same old commission to be fruitful, fill the earth, and bear the divine image. And he hung his war bow in the clouds, the rainbow, and swore never again to unmake the world by water. Here, at the worst imaginable moment, is the first full sighting of the floor this book leaned on in chapter 2. A God who never lets his faithful people perish. Noah is the first of the hidden faithful whom God has not, in any age, permitted to vanish. One might suppose the flood would have cured it. It did not, for one cannot drown a made-up mind. It came up through the water in the same hearts it had always inhabited. A few chapters later, the human race, multiplied again and speaking one language, makes its most ambitious attempt yet. They gather on a plain in Shinar and say to one another, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves." Read the words slowly, for there the made-up mind grown to full height. In the garden, it was one woman reaching for one fruit to make one wise. Now, it is an entire civilization, organized, ambitious, collaborative, raising a tower to storm heaven on its own terms, and above all to make a name for itself. To be its own God, its own authority, its own source. No longer a private failing, but a public program. A whole religion of human self-sufficiency, complete with bricks and mortar and a building committee. This is what the made-up mind always craves, scaled to a skyline. We will decide. We will ascend. We will name ourselves. And God came down, the narrator's gentle irony, that he must ascend even to inspect the tower meant to reach him, and scattered them, confusing their language, so the great self-naming project dissolved into a babel of strangers who could not finish the wall. But something else happened at that scattering, and it is the peace almost no one is taught. The peace that quietly explains the rest of the Bible. When God divided the human race into nations, he did more than jumble their speech. He apportioned them. According to Moses' own later commentary, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. And then the hinge. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. At Babel, in this reading, God disinherited the nations. He allotted them to lesser spiritual powers, the sons of God, and for the time being kept none of them as his own. Until, generations on, he would take one nation, Israel, for his direct portion. So, the world that walks out of Babel is not a neutral one. It is a world divided into nations, each running on its own made-up mind, each under the management of a rival power. The very powers named at the door, the ones the reader renounced, were handed their territories here. And now, the true magnitude of the thing comes into view. The made-up mind is not a private quirk, or even merely a human habit. After Babel, it is the operating system of an occupied world. Every nation sourcing its own mind, every nation under a power glad to keep it so. When you stood at the door and renounced the powers of darkness and the kingdoms of this world, this is the regime you were defecting from. The whole Babel world, the global confederacy of self-made minds under rival kings. It is essential to say precisely what these powers are and are not. The sons of God are creatures, created spiritual beings, in rebellion, allotted their dominion by the One Most High. And the material world they oversee is God's own good creation, temporarily under occupation, destined to be reclaimed. They are not a rival creator. There is no second God who made an evil matter. This is the structural opposite of the Gnostic cosmos, in which the world itself is the botched work of an inferior power and matter is the prison. Here the world is good and occupied, not evil and made. The problem is rebel governance, not corrupt material. And the answer is liberation and re-inheritance, not escape. The difference will matter to the very last page. Here is the good news, and it arrives in the very next breath of the narrative. At Babel the race had said, "Let us make a name for ourselves." And in the next chapter God walks up to a single, childless, unremarkable old man named Abram, in one of those power-zone nations and says, "I will make your name great." Feel the distance between the two sentences, for the whole rescue turns on it. Babel grasps at a name. Abram is given one. Babel sources its greatness from below, by its own bricks and its own will. Abram receives his from above, as gift, from the only one who can confer it. It is the contrast of chapter 4, the seize mind and the receive mind, now written across the entire human story. The world busies itself making names. God answers by quietly giving a name to one man, and beginning in him a whole new people who will learn, slowly and the hard way over centuries, to receive everything from their Father rather than spin it for themselves. That is the rescue, and it opens not with a flood or a tower, but with a call. Come out of the Babel world, out from under the powers, and let me give you what they could only counterfeit. And the long road from that one called man leads, in time, to a wilderness and to a son who would receive everything from his Father and grasp at nothing. So, why spend a chapter on a flood and a tower on the way to the mind of Christ? Because until one has seen the scale of it, one keeps treating the made-up mind as a small thing. A bad habit, a personality quirk, something a little more sincerity might fix. Genesis will not permit it. It shows the counterfeit grown to full height. Universal, contagious, supernaturally supplied, built into civilizations, governing the nations. That is the current one swims against every time one tries to receive one's mind from God rather than spin one's own. No wonder it is hard. It is not a habit one is fighting. It is an empire one is defecting from. But Genesis shows something else, just as true and far stronger. When the whole world's mind was gone, God kept a Noah. When the nations were handed to the powers, God kept and called an Abram. He has never, in the darkest age, been without his hidden faithful, and he has never ceased walking up to one more unremarkable person with the same word. Come out, and let me give you a mind that is actually mine, he said to Abram. He says it still. And so we follow that one called man out of the wreckage of Babel and into the next stretch of the road.